All right, everyone, it is Wednesday, so that means it is time for our political update. I'm Atlanta News First political reporter Doug Reardon. Very busy week in politics, certainly, and a lot of it was driven by a tragedy, no other word for it, in Athens, Georgia, home of University of Georgia, where this week, 22-year-old nursing student Laken Riley, who attended a nearby college but spent a lot of time on the University of Georgia campus, was found dead on a running trail there. It was very quickly understood by police and, of course, by us and the public that the man accused of killing her, 26-year-old Jose Ibarra, is in the country illegally. That sparked a lot of conversation about immigration, the crisis at the border, and what is being done on this as far as policy goes. And so, of course, Georgia lawmakers, certainly no shortage of them weighing in on this. Our Chelsea Beimfohr is a UGA grad herself and has been covering this story. She starts us off on this political update Wednesday with what Georgia lawmakers have been saying about this and what might be done here in the near future.
And an unwillingness by this White House to secure the southern border.
Political tensions flaring up across Georgia this week following the murder of nursing student Laken Riley on UGA's campus. Police say she was killed by an undocumented immigrant from Venezuela. Many Republican lawmakers now pointing the finger at the White House and so-called sanctuary cities across the state.
Noteworthy in Georgia are sanctuary cities that have laws in place that prohibit law enforcement officers from inquiring about someone's legal status in the country.
The state legislature passed a law back in 2009 banning sanctuary cities in Georgia, but there seems to be loopholes, with some local jurisdictions choosing to limit communication with ICE in order to protect immigrants from deportation. In 2017, Clarkston, Georgia passed a resolution banning law enforcement from arresting, detaining, or transporting anyone solely on the basis of an ICE detainer request.
Athens Clarke County would not state that they are a sanctuary city, but they do have laws in place that protect individuals that are undocumented within the state.
Under current policy, the Clarke County Sheriff's Office says staff shall make prompt notification to the appropriate United States agency or foreign consulate when a foreign national is taken into custody. The policy goes on to say they won't hold someone on a detainer unless it's accompanied by a warrant, and a person will be released within 48 hours unless picked up by the feds. Many Republican lawmakers now calling on Athens and other cities to rethink their policies.
When you see policies in cities and counties around the country that embrace a sanctuary city law where you're just going to ignore certain laws that have been passed by state legislatures or Congress, it creates dangerous situations.
Chelsea Beimfohr, Atlanta News First.
And, another big part of this has been talk about sanctuary cities. I think everyone is familiar with what that is. A lot of places in liberal areas, progressive areas, have declared themselves sanctuary cities. Essentially what that is a municipality, a city, a county even, and we have several here in Georgia that I'll mention in just a minute, that have really limited their communication with federal authorities on migrants in their communities who might be there illegally without documentation. There's been a lot of confusion this week over whether Athens is a sanctuary city. They had made some note in the past that they were a welcoming city, that they were very accepting of people who are undocumented, but today we got a little bit of clarification on that from the city's governor of Athens, Clarke County there, the mayor of Athens, Clarke County, holding a press conference this morning, kind of clearing up exactly what their stance was on that. Again, a sanctuary city is a place that really does not coordinate with immigrations and customs enforcement as far as alerting them to who might be in their area. But our Rebecca Schramm was in Athens, Clarke County this morning for what turned out to be a very fiery press conference with the mayor there. So we're going to play that out for you now.
It's unclear if the mayor knew that some of his most vocal critics would be in the audience during that news conference. They were, and this is some of what happened.
I begin by noting that we're all grieving the loss of Laken Riley.
The news conference started out calm. Kelly Gertz, mayor of the consolidated Athens-Clarke County government, outlined more than $500,000 in new safety initiatives he's proposing, including a real-time crime center, mobile surveillance trailers, and new ATVs for officers. But listen to what happened when the mayor started talking about sanctuary cities, insisting that Athens is not one.
And no policies have been adopted by the mayor and commission that have created sanctuary city status in Athens.
You need to resign.
Reporters asked him if he'd like to address the protesters.
And everybody expresses their hurt differently.
Who voted to make Athens-Clarke County a sanctuary city, sir? Who?
No policies have been adopted by the mayor and commission that have created sanctuary city status in Athens.
You need to resign.
One protocol that sometimes arises.
Resign!
Gertz insisted a 2019 resolution he signed was simply to express to immigrants that they're welcome in Athens, that it does not provide legal protections. When asked if he owes Laken Riley's family an apology, Mayor Gertz said this.
We are deeply sorry for this tragedy. The responsibility for this crime rests solely upon the perpetrator.
No, rest on you, sir.
The mayor said he'd be happy to have a meeting with some of those protesters. By the way, you notice police did not remove the protesters despite the shouting. Keep in mind, some of these are the same people who supported police officers during the Defund the Police movement a few years ago. In Athens, Rebecca Schramm, Atlanta News First.
All right, and thanks to Rebecca for that. And just continuing on this a little bit more, a lot of Georgia lawmakers, some that we heard from earlier when we watched Chelsea's story, are now calling for stricter penalties for sheriffs who do not enforce communication on undocumented migrants in their community. Again, this is something that is very unclear in Georgia law as to who needs to tell who what when in regards to who is in their community and who might be undocumented. And that's especially true when it comes to who is in certain communities, jails, and the communication that sheriffs and law enforcement have with the federal government and with the state government about that. Our Abby Kasouris, our statewide political reporter, did a great story on that, so we're going to let you hear from her now as well.
If not, shame on us.
Representative Jesse Petrie says some sheriffs in sanctuary cities are purposefully not recording and reporting inmate data to the federal government, even though it's required under Georgia law.
This bill was presented to the sheriffs a year ago, long before recent comments about the horrible tragedy that took place.
He hopes his bill will flag anyone in our state illegally so that Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents can pick up their case. The bill is picking up traction in the state capitol after the death of 22-year-old nursing student Laken Riley. ICE confirms the man charged with her murder, Jose Ibarra, is an undocumented immigrant. He had a previous arrest and was out on parole awaiting further processing.
Criminalizing this is a little bit of an overstep.
Terry Norris with the Georgia Sheriff's Association says the bill is based off of a misconception. A poll of sheriffs across the state show most respondents are reporting. A misdemeanor charge could mean a suspension, but not an immediate vacancy of office. The Georgia Sheriff's Association suggests changing that to a lesser sentence.
Abby Kasouris, Atlanta News First.
All right, thanks to Abby for that. So, of course, we're going to have a lot more coverage on this. I feel as though this story is just getting started when it comes to some of the political implications that could come out of 22-year-old Laken Riley's death. But, of course, we here at Atlanta News First, certainly our thoughts are with her family and the entire UGA community today as we continue covering this. But, as I mentioned, it was a big week in political headlines, and that includes the movement in the Fani Willis Georgia election indictment saga, I guess we could call it at this point, just another chapter here. We heard from a familiar face just this week who we had heard from before. Let's bring you back to the very beginning of this. Michael Roman, who is one of the defendants in the Georgia election indictment. He's a former White House aide. He was a campaign staffer here for the Trump campaign when he was running. Former President Donald Trump was in 2020. He was accused in this election indictment, and his attorneys just a few weeks ago, really now a couple months ago at this point, filed a motion seeking to get District Attorney Fani Willis as well as the man she hired to be Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade off of this case because of what they said was an improper relationship between the two of them. And this has been going on ever since then. So Terrence Bradley is a former law partner of Nathan Wade, that special prosecutor. He also represented Wade in his divorce case. He was at one point someone who defense attorneys questioning him over this motion called their star witness. He said that they were going to be able to go back and prove that Bradley could tell them the relationship started before Willis or Wade claimed that it did in legal filings, and thus that they have been lying to the court this whole time about the relationship. And there we see Bradley on the stand. But this is his third time doing this. He was, again, as I mentioned, Nathan Wade's attorney. And so the first time he got up there to be questioned, as well as the second last week, he really gave no answers at all. He asserted attorney-client privilege. Everyone's familiar with that. You can't talk about what goes on between an attorney and their client as it relates to a case. And it was so bad that the defense actually asked the judge to do something about it and draw a line and say, where exactly does privilege come in and where can it be left out? And so they had a closed-door meeting on Monday. It lasted about 2 hours, we're told, between Mr. Bradley and the judge in this case. And the judge decided that questions about this relationship were actually on the table. They could be answered by Bradley. There was no privilege involved between him and Mr. Wade there. But the problem was he didn't really say much. He said he had no idea when the relationship started. And despite the fact that he had represented Mr. Wade for the better part of 5 years, and as well as worked with him very closely, they only had one conversation about the relationship that he shared with District Attorney Willis, and he said it was of no substance, it was of really no consequence at all to what defense attorneys were trying to prove here, that this started before Willis and Wade said it did. And so he really went from being a star witness to not telling the court much at all. At times it was still very choppy as far as the number of objections that we heard in court. When Bradley went to answer a question, he was cut off by attorneys for the state objecting to the line of questioning and what he could and couldn't say. And so kind of a bust day in court for defense attorneys. But we will be back in court on this on Friday so that the attorneys for both the defendants in this case and the state can make their case as far as keeping Willis and Wade on the case or removing them from it entirely. So we are going to have yet another chapter in this on Friday when this is back in court, I think about 9 a.m. in the morning. So if anyone's looking to tune into that coverage, we will be carrying it here on Atlanta News First. That will very likely be the last time we hear from attorneys before a decision is made on keeping Wade and Willis or letting them go from this case. And then, of course, what happens to it after that, we don't know. And a couple other final things I want to run through here. Reproductive rights. Obviously, we had that huge Alabama Supreme Court ruling that essentially gave frozen embryos status as children in the state. And so what happened as a result of that was a lot of IVF facilities, including the University of Alabama Hospital, one of the biggest there in the state, actually stopped doing IVF treatments altogether. They said the risk was too high. They didn't want to be held liable for anything that could come with, destroying or doing some sort of damage to these embryos that are now considered children. And of course, that had wide-reaching impacts all across the country, including here in Georgia, where just today, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party in the state Senate introduced legislation to protect women who want to use in vitro fertilization to start their families. She introduced a bill that would guarantee them that right, and also to guarantee people a right to contraception, men and women. And so today our Asia Wilson was at the Capitol when that announcement was made. We're going to turn it over to her now for some coverage on that.
That's right. Democratic leaders are looking to do everything they can to put federal protections in place. It's the reason why Senator Elena Parent and others will have that press conference today. Parent plans to file Senate Bill 564, also known as the Right to Contraception Act, and Senate Bill 565, the Right to IVF Act. The Right to Contraception Act works to ensure people in the state have access to contraception, while the Right to IVF Act would make sure access to IVF treatment is not compromised by definition or status of a human embryo created outside a human uterus. And now politicians and presidential hopefuls from both sides of the aisle are all sounding off following the Supreme Court ruling in Alabama.
I didn't say that I agreed with the Alabama ruling. What the question that I was asked is, do I believe an embryo is a baby? I do think that if you look in the definition, an embryo is considered an unborn baby.
Mark my words, if we don't act now, it will only get worse. That's why tomorrow I'm headed to the Senate floor to call on my colleagues to pass, via unanimous consent, my Access to Family Building Act, which would ensure that every American's right to become a parent via treatments like IVF is fully protected.
All right, and finally here on Political Update, voter registration, right? We have a big election coming up in November. It is always an election cycle here in Georgia, but we, of course, have the presidential vote coming up in November. We have the primaries coming up in just about a month from now. So everyone should be thinking about how they are going to register to vote if they are not already registered. And the reason I say it like that is because when you go here in Georgia to get your driver's license, you have the option to opt out of automatic voter registration, but if you don't do that, you are automatically registered to vote at the address where you have your license registered at. So that's the way it's been here for a long time. But just this week, the Georgia GOP took up some concern with that. They said it makes things confusing. They said it could have some repercussions as far as duplicates if you automatically register and then go and register yourself, making things rife for fraud. And so what they did was they introduced legislation to kind of reverse that and say, no, actually you have to opt in to voter registration. It is no longer automatic. Again, this is just a bill that was introduced. It hasn't even passed the House or the Senate yet, only committee. But we are keeping a very close eye on this because this would really change how people register. It would make it a little bit more difficult for those who aren't going to find themselves at a driver's license office anytime soon. But what would happen is you would go, and instead of automatically registering you with an opt-out option, you would be opted out automatically with an opt-in option. So that is what this bill is seeking to do. It would also make it a little easier to challenge voters based on their address. And so it is, again, something that could have some pretty big implications. Now, here's the impact of what this legislation has done, the automatic registration. In 2023, there was a study by the Center for Election Innovation, and it found that the share of active registered voters here in Georgia rose to 98% of eligible voting population. And compared to 2020, before this went into effect, it was at 78%, in 2016. And that was right before the state started the auto registration. So, I mean, almost a 20% jump in that. You can tell it's clearly working really well if the point is to get Georgia voters registered. And so, again, I encourage everyone, if you are not registered at this time, to please make a plan, go ahead, get yourself registered, figure out where you're voting, and do that before we have our primaries coming up here in the next couple of weeks. So, again, a very busy week for us. We hope you learned something from this today, and we will be back next Wednesday at 2 p.m. as we always are with another political update. But for now, I'm Atlanta News First political reporter Doug Reardon from the ANF Plus streaming desk. Have a great Wednesday.